The morning Ronan Creed turned away the richest rancher's daughter in Harrow County, the whole valley decided he'd finally lost his mind. But what they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that by sundown of that same day, he would make a decision so strange, so reckless, that it would set the entire frontier on fire, not with flames, with rage, with envy, and eventually with something nobody in that valley had felt in a long, long time: shame. If you've ever been counted out before you even got started, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The trouble with Ronan Creed was that he didn't want what most men in Harrow County spent their whole lives chasing. He was 34 years old, which put him squarely in what the Valley women called the prime window. Old enough to have built something real, young enough to still be useful. He owned 612 acres of high desert ranch land that stretched from the base of Creed Ridge all the way down to the flat basin where the Sutter River ran thin and stubborn through late summer. The land had been in his family long enough that most people in the county couldn't remember a time when it belonged to someone else, which was the only kind of legacy that mattered out here. He had a house, not a fine one, but a solid one. 2 floors, a wraparound porch that had been patched so many times the original wood was mostly memory, and a kitchen that always smelled faintly of coffee and sawdust regardless of what time of day you walked into it. He had 40 head of cattle, a horse remuda that fluctuated between 16 and 20 animals depending on the season, and 6 ranch hands who had stayed through 2 brutal winters and a summer drought that had turned most of the creek beds in Harrow County into cracked mud puzzles. That kind of loyalty wasn't bought. It was earned, usually through some combination of fair wages, hard work shown beside them, and knowing when to leave a man alone with his thoughts. What Ronan did not have, and what the Valley had very strong opinions about, was a wife. This was considered a problem of some urgency by nearly everyone around him, not because they were worried about his happiness, though a few of the older women in town liked to frame it that way. The real concern was simpler and less flattering. An unmarried man with 600 acres was an unstable element. He was a negotiation that hadn't been closed yet. He was land that hadn't been properly secured. The families who felt this most acutely were the Aldridges, the Pembertons, and the Holloways, the 3 ranching dynasties that controlled the bulk of grazing land in the Upper Valley. Between them, they had 7 unmarried daughters of appropriate age. Between them, they had also spent the better part of 3 years orchestrating what amounted to the most elaborate social campaign in Harrow County history, all of it pointed at the front door of Ronan Creed's porch. They sent daughters to deliver casseroles when one of his hands broke a leg. They arranged for their girls to be at the general store in Millard Creek every Thursday, which happened to be when Ronan came in for supplies. They invited him to dinner parties he didn't want to attend, cattle auctions he had no intention of bidding at least 2 barn dances where the music was suspiciously good for such a remote corner of the territory. And each time, in his own quiet way, Ronan declined. Not rudely. He was never rude. He showed up to the dinners, ate the food, thanked the hosts, and was gone before the second round of drinks. He accepted the casseroles with genuine gratitude and returned the dishes clean. He spoke to the daughters the way he spoke to anyone, directly, without performance, without the particular warmth that a man deploys when he's decided he's interested. And when they left, the daughters reported back to their fathers with varying degrees of frustration. He's perfectly pleasant and completely unreachable. The men of the Valley had theories about this. The most popular one, whispered over fence posts and card tables, was that the trouble had started with Catherine Walsh. Catherine Walsh had been the kind of beautiful that made a room rearrange itself. She had come from the Walsh family up near the territorial border. Old money, old land, the kind of connections that opened doors that didn't have visible handles. She and Ronan had been together for nearly 2 years, long enough that a ring had been discussed, long enough that the Valley had started thinking of them as a single unit. Then, over the course of one particular winter, it came apart. The details were never entirely clear. Ronan never spoke about it, and the Walsh family's version changed depending on who was telling it. But what everyone agreed on was the outcome. Catherine had married Garrett Pemberton, the eldest son of one of the Valley's most powerful ranching families, 6 weeks after she and Ronan ended things. The timing was close enough that even the people who generally tried to think charitably about others found it hard to arrive at flattering conclusions. Ronan had not fallen apart exactly. He hadn't gone on a drinking binge or let his ranch deteriorate or done any of the dramatic things that a man in pain sometimes does when he's trying to convert the feeling into something external and visible. He had simply become more careful, more observant. He started listening differently when women from the wealthy families spoke to him, noticing the way the conversation always eventually turned toward the land, casually, as though by accident, but always there, always circling back. 600 acres. What are your plans for the North Pasture? My father thinks the Sutter River parcel would make wonderful grazing land if someone were to manage it properly. It wasn't subtle once you learned to hear it. He wasn't bitter, exactly. Bitterness was too simple a word for what he'd become. More accurate to say that he had developed a specific and well-founded wariness, the way a man who has stepped on a hidden branch in the dark learns to test the ground more carefully before he puts his weight down. The morning everything changed was in the first week of February, and it was one of those winter mornings that the high desert does better than anywhere else. The sky was so cold and clear, it looked almost lavender, the frost sitting heavy on every surface, the mountains to the northwest cutting sharp white edges against the blue. Ronan had been up since 4:30, the way he usually was, moving through the pre-dawn routine that defined the shape of his days: coffee, the ledger, the slow process of thinking through what needed to be done and in what order. He was headed to Millard Creek to deal with two things: a piece of equipment at the blacksmith's that had been in repair for going on 3 weeks, and a conversation at the bank he'd been putting off because he already knew it wasn't going to go the way he wanted. The ranch's operational costs had run high through the fall: a sick horse that needed a veterinarian from all the way out in Prescott, a section of fencing along the North Ridge that had collapsed under early snow and taken half a week and significant materials to rebuild. Nothing catastrophic, but the ledger had a tone to it he didn't like. He drove the wagon himself, which he preferred. His foreman, a quiet and competent man named Deke Sorrells, had offered to come along, and Ronan had told him he was needed more at the ranch. This was true, but it was also true that Ronan generally dealt with financial conversations better without an audience. The road into Millard Creek wound down from the ridge through a stretch of low scrubland and then opened up onto the flat basin approach to town. It was in this middle section, where the road passed close to the Whitmore homestead, or what used to be the Whitmore homestead, that he saw the smoke. It wasn't the gray column of a cooking fire. It was the thin, desperate trail of a fire that had almost gone out, barely clinging to the morning air, coming from the chimney of a cabin that, by all rights, should have been empty. Old Bernard Whitmore had died in October, and his wife had passed 2 springs before that. They'd had no children. The property sat unresolved in a legal matter between distant relatives who'd never set foot in Harrow County, as far as anyone knew. The cabin itself had been sitting vacant since Bernard's burial. Ronan pulled his wagon to a stop. He sat for a moment, watching the smoke. He was already running later than he liked for Millard Creek. The bank appointment had a time attached to it. The logical thing was to keep moving. He climbed down from the wagon anyway. The cabin yard was a mess. Not the natural disorder of winter, but something more layered and intentional. Someone had stacked salvaged boards along the south wall of the cabin, creating a rough lean-to shelter for what appeared to be a small collection of tools. A clothesline had been strung between 2 fence posts, and on it hung 2 dresses, plain gray cotton, worn thin at the seams, rigid with cold. A barrel near the cabin door had been repurposed as a wood storage box, and beside it was a hatchet and a stack of freshly split kindling, small pieces cut for a fire that wasn't pulling much heat. He knocked. There was a silence on the other side that had a particular quality to it. Not the silence of an empty room, but of someone deciding something. "Who's there?" The voice was a woman's, and it was careful. Not frightened exactly. Measured. "Ronan Creed," he said. "I own the spread up on the ridge. I saw your smoke and stopped to see if everything was all right." Another pause. Then the sound of a latch being worked. The woman who opened the door was not what he expected, though he wasn't sure what he had expected exactly. She was younger than he'd assumed from the voice, mid-20s, maybe younger. Dark hair pulled back with a practical efficiency that suggested she didn't think about it much. Her face was lean in the way that wasn't a choice, and her eyes were dark brown and very direct, the kind of eyes that made a habit of evaluating situations before committing to a response. She was wearing a coat that was too large for her, a man's coat, clearly, the sleeves rolled up twice, and boots that had been resoled at least once with something that wasn't quite the right material. She was holding a cast-iron pan at her side with a relaxed grip that made it clear she hadn't opened the door before deciding she might need it. "Ronan Creed," she repeated. Her expression didn't change much. "I've heard that name." "Most people out here have," he said. "Who are you?" "Elena Ashcroft." She said it the way someone says a name they've had to prove the legitimacy of before, steady, with a slight forward weight to it, like she was ready for someone to challenge it. "You related to the Whitmore family?" "No." "So what are you doing in their cabin?" She looked at him for a moment. Her grip on the pan didn't change. "Surviving," she said. "What are you doing in their yard?" He almost smiled. He caught himself. "The property's in legal dispute, you know that?" "I know." She paused. "I also know the lawyers won't resolve it until spring at the earliest. The Whitmore relatives don't know this place exists well enough to use it, and it was empty and half deteriorating while I was sleeping outside." She kept her eyes level on him. "If someone with a legal claim wants to come and tell me to go, I'll go, but I'm not going to stand in an empty yard and argue about it with a neighbor." Ronan looked past her into the cabin. What he could see of it was stripped down to function. A bedroll on a wooden frame that she'd probably built herself. A small table. The fire in the hearth was burning low and slow, the kind of fire that's been carefully rationed. The stack of split wood beside it was small, maybe 2 days' worth, if she was conservative with it. "How long have you been here?" "Since November." November. The worst cold hadn't come until December, but November in the high desert still got down to temperatures that could kill you if you were unprepared. "Alone?" "Yes." "Where are you from originally?" Something shifted in her expression. Not pain, exactly. More like the faint irritation of someone who gets asked a question they're tired of. "Does it matter?" "I suppose not," he said. He stood there for another moment. The logical part of his thinking said this was not his problem. The woman was clearly capable. She'd made it through the harshest months of the winter alone in a half-broken cabin. She'd organized herself. She'd found ways to keep the fire going. She wasn't asking him for anything. He could tip his hat and leave and arrive at the bank only slightly behind schedule. "You have enough wood?" he asked. She glanced at the pile. "I'll need to cut more tomorrow." "There's a cord and a half of split pine stacked at the back of my east barn," he said. "More than I need right now. I'll send one of my hands over with a load." The look she gave him was not grateful, or not only grateful. It was also cautious, measuring. "Why?" "Because it's February," he said. "And that fire isn't going to keep the cabin above freezing if the temperature drops another 10 degrees. She held his gaze for a moment. "I don't like owing people." "I'm not asking you to owe me anything," he said. "Consider it neighborly." "We're not exactly neighbors." "Close enough," he said. He left shortly after, climbed back onto the wagon, and continued toward Millard Creek. The bank meeting was what he'd expected. Numbers presented calmly by a man who was genuinely trying to be helpful, but whose hands were largely tied. A suggestion about reducing the herd for the coming year. A conversation about the interest structure on the operational loan. He listened, asked his questions, came away with no solutions but a clearer picture of the terrain. He picked up the equipment from the blacksmith, bought his supplies at the general store, and drove back up the ridge road as the sun started to tip toward the western mountains. He passed the Whitmore cabin on the way back. The smoke from the chimney was a little stronger now. He told himself it was probably not his business. He sent the firewood over the next morning anyway. What happened after that was not dramatic. That was the part that nobody in Harrow County ever quite believed later on, that it hadn't started with a grand gesture or a lightning bolt moment. It had started with firewood, and then a question about the cabin's roof, and then Ronan mentioning almost offhandedly that his ranch could use an extra hand through the last of the winter, someone to help with the books, and to assist his housekeeper, Mrs. Garza, who was getting older and found the heavier indoor work harder than she used to. Elena had said she'd think about it. She came to the ranch 3 days later with her bedroll and her too large coat and a canvas bag that held everything she owned. She didn't say much about whether she'd thought about it or what had tipped her toward yes. She looked at the ranch, at the house, at Mrs. Garza, who met her at the kitchen door and assessed her with the efficient frankness of a woman who had been running someone else's household for 20 years. And then she said she could start immediately. The first few weeks, she was careful the way you are when you're in someone else's space and you're not sure yet what the rules are. She helped Mrs. Garza with the household work, learned the organization of the larder and the linen closet, and started to understand the rhythm of the ranch. She ate her meals in the kitchen with Mrs. Garza most nights, and occasionally at the table with Ronan when the work schedule required the kind of coordination that was easier done over food. It was in those kitchen table conversations that she started to show him what she actually knew. She had a mind that moved the way a good working dog moves, efficiently, without wasted motion, always oriented toward the practical. She had worked on a farm before. More than one, she said, though she said it without elaboration. She knew irrigation, specifically the older channel and berm methods that most of the valley ranchers had abandoned in favor of newer approaches, not because the old ways didn't work, but because they required more initial labor to set up. She knew horses, not in the sentimental way that some people knew horses, but in the diagnostic way. She could watch an animal move for 5 minutes and tell you things about its legs and spine that would take a veterinarian an examination to confirm. Ronan's foreman Deke was skeptical of her, in the way that men who've been doing something a long time are often skeptical of anyone who comes at the same problem from a different direction. He was polite to her because that was his nature, but he asked her opinion on nothing and made it clear, without saying so directly, that he considered her presence a temporary curiosity. His ranch hands were more variable. 2 of the younger ones, a pair of brothers named Cal and Teddy Marsh, were friendly toward her in the uncomplicated way of people who don't have strong feelings about the politics involved. The older hands, a sun-hardened man named Abe, who had been at the ranch since before Ronan's time, and a quiet, taciturn individual called Rouse, who never spoke if a gesture would do, treated her with a careful neutrality that wasn't unfriendly but wasn't warm either. Then one afternoon, about 6 weeks after she arrived, Ronan's best working mare, a dark bay named Pora that he'd raised from a foal and trusted beyond any other animal on the ranch, started showing signs of something wrong. She was off her feed, moving stiffly, and had a heat in her right foreleg that Abe found during the evening check and immediately flagged. The nearest veterinarian was a day's ride in good weather. The next morning would bring a freeze. Ronan was in the barn with Abe and Deke trying to work out options when Elena appeared at the barn door. "What's wrong with her?" she asked. "We don't know," Ronan said. "Forelegs hot. She's not eating." Elena came into the barn without being invited. She approached the horse slowly, speaking in a low, continuous murmur that was half words and half sound, and Pora, who had been shifting anxiously, went still. Elena ran her hands down the leg from the knee, pressed at specific points with careful fingers, watched the horse's response. "She's got the beginning of a tendon strain," Elena said. "Right here." She indicated a spot just above the fetlock. "The heat's inflammation, not infection. If you ice it tonight and keep her off the leg for a week, she should be fine. If you leave it and try to work her, you'll be looking at a serious injury inside of a month." Deke looked at Ronan. Ronan looked at Elena. "You sure?" "No," she said honestly. "I'm sure enough that I'd stake the horse on it, not sure enough that I'd stake money I couldn't afford to lose. If you can get the veterinarian out in the next few days to confirm, that would be better." Ronan sent for the veterinarian. When the man arrived 2 days later, delayed by weather, his examination took considerably longer than Elena's had, cost considerably more, and arrived at the same conclusion. After that, Deke started asking her opinion. It was one of Ronan's hands, a loose-tongued young man named Roy, who didn't stay employed at the ranch much past spring for unrelated reasons, who first carried word into Millard Creek that Ronan Creed had taken in an orphan woman and seemed to be spending an unusual amount of time in conversation with her. By the time this information had traveled through the general store, the barber shop, the feed supply, and the Saturday gathering at the Aldridge Ranch, it had already transformed into something considerably more charged than what it actually was. But the direction of the transformation was, if anything, underestimating the reality. Because the reality, by the time Harrow County's social network got around to discussing it, was already more significant than Roy's original report. Ronan had started relying on Elena's judgment, not just about the horse, about the ranch, about the irrigation problem on the south fields that had been reducing yield for 3 years, about the grazing rotation schedule that Deke defended more out of habit than evidence, about the books, which she had an eye for that was sharper than anyone else he'd worked with. He didn't think about this very clearly at first. It just became the shape of his days. The morning coffee, where he'd lay out what needed doing, and she'd raise a question or observation that changed how he thought about it. The evenings when she'd sit at the kitchen table with the ledger and work through numbers with the focused quiet of someone who found it genuinely interesting rather than tedious. He noticed, without quite deciding what to do with the information, that she never asked about the land, never asked how many acres, what it was worth, what his plans were for the parcels closer to the river, never positioned any of her ideas as something she had a stake in. She would propose something, explain her reasoning, and then step back from it entirely, as though whether it happened or not was a matter of complete indifference to her. He'd never experienced that from anyone in his professional life. He wasn't sure he'd experienced it in his personal life either. The ranch hands noticed this before he fully articulated it to himself. Abe, the oldest of them, said something about it one evening when Ronan was in the barn doing a final check before nightfall. "She doesn't push," Abe said, which was the kind of observation that sounded simple until you thought about it. "No," Ronan agreed. Abe was quiet for a moment, doing something careful and unhurried with a piece of tack. "Somebody taught her not to," he said finally. "Or something." He didn't expand on this, and Ronan didn't ask him to. The formal social confrontation came in mid-March at a gathering that Harlan Aldridge hosted under the guise of a spring planning meeting, the kind of meeting where the major ranchers of the valley discussed shared concerns about grazing rights and water usage. Ronan attended these not because he enjoyed them, but because failing to show up was a statement he couldn't afford to make. The Aldridge house was a large, carefully maintained operation that served as an implicit ongoing argument about what a ranch should look like. The furniture was heavy and deliberate. The curtains were ordered from somewhere east. Everything about it announced that the Aldridges had made it, that the frontier was for other people to find difficult. Ronan arrived on time. Harlan met him at the door with the particular kind of warmth that businessmen deploy when they've already decided what they want from the meeting. "Glad you could make it," Harlan said. "We were starting to think you might be too busy up at the ranch." "The ranch keeps me busy," Ronan said. "But not that busy." Inside, there were 8 or 9 men. The Pembertons, father and son, Joel Calloway from the Eastern Watershed, the Morrow brothers who ran a cattle operation so large it functioned almost as its own economy. Standing near the fireplace in a cluster that managed to look casual while clearly being intentional were 3 of Aldridge's daughters. Margaret, who was the eldest and the one most frequently presented at social occasions, and 2 of the younger ones whose names Ronan could never remember without effort. The conversation started with genuine ranch business. The state of the spring graze, a water rights dispute in the Southern Territory that Calloway was managing, projections for the coming summer's rainfall based on the winter's snowpack in the mountains. Ronan participated in this part without difficulty. He knew the issues, had thoughts about them, and said what he thought without either holding back or performing. It was after the formal business concluded, when the whiskey appeared and the gathering became social, that Harlan steered things toward where he'd wanted them to go all along. "Here you've got a new addition at the ranch," Harlan said, with the careful casualness of a man who has been waiting to say something. The room got a shade quieter. Not much, just enough to notice. "I hired on some help in February," Ronan said. "Ranch needed another hand, nothing unusual about that." "The way I heard it described," said Arthur Pemberton, whose voice carried the satisfied weight of someone who has not been the target of a conversation and is therefore relaxed, "it was something a little more particular than ranch help." "The way things get described between here and where they happen can change considerably," Ronan said. "She's an orphan," Margaret Aldridge said, and the way she said it wasn't cruel exactly, but it had a precision to it that wasn't kind. "An orphan woman living at your ranch. You can understand why that's something people are talking about. People talk about a lot of things, Ronan said. Ronan. Harlan put his glass down with the deliberateness of a man making a point. Nobody here is trying to be unfriendly, but you've got a responsibility to this valley, to the relationships that hold it together. The Aldrich family has been your neighbor for 20 years. The Pembertons have water rights that connect directly to your southern pasture. These things matter. Who you associate yourself with, who you bring onto your land, that matters too, whether you like thinking about it or not. Ronan set his own glass down. Say what you mean, Harlan. Harlan looked at him for a moment. There are women in this valley with family, with property, with connections that could strengthen what you've built. Good women from good families who'd make fine partners for a man in your position. It seems strange to pass all of that by in favor of... He paused, choosing an unknown quantity. The room held its breath for just a second. You know what my problem is with that thinking? Ronan said. His voice was even, but there was something in it that was not quite as easy as his expression. Every woman in this room that you'd point me toward, I'd be marrying her family, her father's land ambitions, and her brother's debts, and her mother's ideas about how my ranch should be run. I'd be buying into alliances I didn't choose and obligations I didn't ask for, and I've seen enough of that to know it's not something I want. And instead you want... What? Arthur Pemberton said. A woman with nothing to offer? I want someone I can actually trust, Ronan said. Those aren't the same shortage. He left shortly after. The wagon ride back up the ridge in the dark was cold and silent, and he sat in it thinking about whether he'd said too much or not enough, and arriving at the conclusion that the question didn't matter. He'd said what was true. That was enough, or it wasn't, and he couldn't do much about which one it turned out to be. When he got back to the ranch, the kitchen light was still on. Elena was at the table with the ledger, exactly where he'd half expected her to be. Late, she said without looking up. The meeting ran long. He hung up his coat and poured the last of the evening coffee, which was strong and slightly past its best, and sat down across from her. Anything in the books? Some things I want to show you tomorrow, she said. The feed costs are running higher than I'd expect for the size of the herd you're carrying. I think the supplier is shorting the weight on the deliveries. I want to check against the receipts. He looked at her across the table. The lamplight was yellow and quiet. You've been checking the weights against the receipts. Not yet. I want to do it properly with you there. You think we're being cheated? I think it's possible, she said. I don't want to say something definite until I'm sure. He nodded slowly. Outside, the wind was picking up again, coming down off the ridge the way it did in early spring, still cold, carrying the memory of winter in it. He could hear it pushing at the window frames. They talked about you tonight, he said. She looked up from the ledger. Her expression was difficult to read, but not entirely unreadable. I assumed they might. They wanted to know why I wasn't pursuing a better option. He held her gaze. Their word, not mine. She didn't flinch. What did you tell them? Something close to the truth, he said. She looked at him for a moment longer, then back down at the ledger. What does that mean? It means I told them I trusted your judgment, he said, and that I'd been short on that and the people around me for long enough that it mattered more to me than whatever alliances they were trying to sell. The kitchen was quiet. The wind pressed against the window. That's going to make things harder, she said, for both of us. Probably, he said. She nodded once, slowly, in the way of someone who has accepted the terms of a difficult situation. Then we'd better make sure the ranch is strong enough to handle it. He looked at her across the lamplight. He thought about what Abe had said. She doesn't push. And about what that absence of pressure felt like after years of its opposite. Like being able to set something heavy down for the first time in a long time without worrying about what you'd find underneath it. Get some sleep, he said. We'll look at the receipts in the morning. She closed the ledger, pushed back from the table, and carried her coffee cup to the sink. At the kitchen door, she paused. Ronan, she said. He looked up. Thank you, she said. For the firewood. In February. A pause. I never said it properly. You didn't have to. I know, she said. That's why I'm saying it. She went upstairs. He sat at the kitchen table a while longer, listening to the wind work at the house, and thought about the weeks ahead. They would be difficult. He knew that with the certainty of a man who had lived in this valley long enough to understand how it operated, how it punished deviation, how it organized itself against anything it didn't recognize. But the feed receipts were wrong. He was certain of it now, even before he checked. And the irrigation problem on the South Fields had been costing him 2 years of yield without anyone doing anything about it. And Pora was sound and walking easy on the leg that she'd diagnosed correctly, while the valley's ranchers were busy deciding what category Elena Ashcroft belonged in. There were more important things to work on than what Harlan Aldridge thought about his choices. He finished his coffee, banked the fire, and went to bed. Outside, the wind kept moving down off the ridge, cold and honest and indifferent to everyone's opinions, the way it always had. The feed receipts were short, not by accident. Elena laid it out on the kitchen table the following morning with the methodical patience of someone who'd done this kind of accounting before, not with a ledger in a proper office somewhere, but at a rougher table, under worse light, checking numbers that mattered in the immediate and pressing way that numbers matter when there's not much margin for error. She had pulled every receipt from the past 8 months, organized them by delivery date, and cross-referenced the stated weights against the actual consumption figures from the herd records. "Here," she said, setting 2 columns of numbers in front of Ronan. "Every delivery from Galt Supply since July. The stated weight is what the receipt says. The consumption column is what the herd actually used, based on head count and feeding schedule." She tapped the bottom of the page. "The difference over 8 months is 240 pounds of feed you paid for and didn't receive." Ronan looked at the numbers for a long time without saying anything. He wasn't questioning them. They were too clean and too consistent to question. He was thinking about the fact that Walt Galt had been his supplier for 4 years, that they'd shaken hands across a counter enough times to have something that resembled a relationship, that he'd trusted the process without auditing it, because trusting the process was what men in the valley did with each other. 240 pounds, he said. "Give or take 10, depending on measurement variance," Elena said. "But the pattern is consistent across all 8 months. It's not a mistake. Mistakes are random. This isn't random." He nodded once. "I'll go talk to Walt." "I want to come," she said. He looked at her. "You don't need to." "I know." She held his gaze. "I want to." He thought about saying no, and then thought about why he'd want to say no, and couldn't land on a reason that wasn't really about what other people would say, rather than what made practical sense. Elena had built the case. She knew the numbers better than he did. If the conversation with Walt got complicated, and it might, he'd rather have the person who could explain the discrepancies standing next to him than back at the ranch. "All right," he said. Walt Galt was a thick-built man in his late 50s who ran his supply operation from a warehouse at the south end of Millard Creek with the unshakable confidence of someone who has never been seriously challenged in his professional life. He greeted Ronan with the usual broad handshake and the usual offer of coffee, and then he noticed Elena standing slightly behind and to the left of Ronan, and his expression went through a quick rearrangement that he managed without much grace. "Mr. Creed," he said, "wasn't expecting you today." "Wasn't planning to come," Ronan said. "Ran into something in my books that needed sorting." He set Elena's compiled figures on the counter. "Take a look at those." Walt looked at the papers with the wariness of a man who already has some sense of what he might find. He went through them slowly. His jaw moved slightly, the way jaws do when someone is processing something they'd prefer not to. "These figures," he started, "are accurate," Elena said. Her voice was even, not aggressive, not apologetic, factual. "I can walk you through the methodology if there's a specific number you want to dispute." Walt looked at her. It was the kind of look that men give women who have just said something inconveniently competent, a look that's trying to decide whether to be dismissive or careful. He looked back at Ronan. "There might have been some measurement inconsistencies," he said, "in the weighing process. I'll look into it." "You'll look into it, and you'll credit the ranch for the full 240 pounds at the current rate," Ronan said, "and your scale gets checked by an independent party before the next delivery." Walt's face moved through several positions. "Ronan, we've done business for 4 years. And I'd like to keep doing it, Ronan said, on accurate terms. They left with a written credit agreement and Walt's assurance that the scale would be inspected. Whether that assurance held was something they'd verify later. On the street outside, Ronan stood for a moment in the late morning light and felt the specific fatigue that comes from discovering that something you assumed was solid has been quietly hollow for a while. You knew before you checked, Elena said. It wasn't a question. I suspected, he said. Didn't want to suspect. That's different from knowing, she said. Yeah, he said. It is. They drove back up the ridge in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. Somewhere around the second bend past the Whitmore cabin, Elena's old shelter, still standing, still empty, she said, without looking at him, He'll tell people. Walt? That you came in with me, that I was the one who brought the complaint. She turned her face toward the mountains. People will read it a particular way. People already have opinions, Ronan said. Haven't changed anything yet. It might get worse before it levels out. Probably will, he said. And then, after a pause, does that change anything for you? She thought about it honestly, which was the thing about her. She didn't answer fast when the question deserved more than a fast answer. No, she said finally. I just want you to know I'm aware of it. He kept his eyes on the road. I know you are. Spring came to Harrow County with the usual combination of relief and new problems. The snow pulled back from the lower elevations, the creek beds filled up again, and the land that had been locked and gray and unreadable since November began to show what it had decided to do with itself over winter. Some years that was hopeful. This year it was complicated. The South Fields, the section Elena had identified as having a water distribution problem, were in worse shape than even the worst reading of last season's numbers had suggested. The irrigation channels that Deke had been running off the main creek diversion were silted up badly, the kind of gradual blockage that happens so slowly nobody notices until the yield figures force the question. Two sections of the east pasture were showing the pale, thin grass of ground that had been carrying too many cattle for too long without rotation. Elena walked the fields with Deke on a Tuesday morning in early April while Ronan was dealing with the veterinarian's follow-up on Pora. This was not, technically, something Deke had agreed to. Elena had simply materialized at the barn at the time Deke was heading out and fallen in to step beside him without asking permission, carrying a notebook and wearing her practical boots, and Deke, who was not by nature a confrontational man, had not figured out a graceful way to tell her to go back to the house. By the time they reached the Southfield boundary, she had asked him 4 questions about the irrigation setup, all of them good questions, none of them phrased in a way that made him feel like he was being tested. He found himself answering them with more detail than he'd intended to. The problem isn't the volume of water, she said, looking at the main channel where it came off the creek diversion. The volume's probably fine. The problem is distribution. The secondary channels are running the wrong gradient. They're depositing silt instead of carrying it through. She walked along the bank, toe of her boot dragging lightly in the edge of the channel. If you regraded these 2 main secondaries and added catch basins here and here, she pointed, you'd clear the silt problem and distribute the water further into the field than you're getting now. Deke looked at the points she was indicating. He'd been foreman here for 7 years. He'd looked at this channel every season. The idea she was describing wasn't complicated. It was actually simple, in the way that things are simple once someone says them out loud, and he couldn't entirely explain to himself why he hadn't seen it. That's a significant amount of rework, he said, which was true but was also, he was aware, a deflection. It is, she agreed, less significant than losing another season of yield from these fields. He didn't say anything for a moment. A red-tailed hawk was working the far end of the pasture, low and efficient, and they both watched it without meaning to. I'll bring it up with Ronan, he said. That's all I'm asking, she said. When he did bring it up with Ronan that evening, presenting the idea in the careful, slightly reluctant way of a man who isn't entirely sure he wants to be seen advocating for someone else's suggestion, Ronan listened, asked 2 specific questions, and told him to price out the labor and materials. Deke did, which meant he spent the next 2 days with Elena going over the specifics in more detail than he'd originally intended, because she had thoughts about materials and sequencing that were hard to dismiss once they were laid out on the table. By the end of those 2 days, something had shifted between them that neither of them would have called friendship exactly, but that had more substance to it than what they'd started with. The regrading work began in the 3rd week of April, with Cal and Teddy Marsh doing most of the physical labor, and Elena working alongside them with a consistency that the brothers found both surprising and, after a day or two, unworthy of comment. She dug where digging needed to happen. She laid in the catch basin frames herself, because she designed them, and it was faster to do it than to explain it. By the end of the 1st week, the East Secondary was running clear, and the water distribution to the South Fields had already visibly improved. Abe, watching all of this from a distance with the patient attention of a man who has seen a lot and reached the age where he doesn't need to comment on all of it, made one remark to Ronan during the 2nd week of the regrading project. "She's going to turn this place around," he said, "if the valley lets her." "If," Ronan said. "That's the part that worries me," Abe said. The part that worried Abe was already in motion. What had begun as social commentary, the whispered exchange of opinions about Ronan's odd choice, the polite disdain offered to Elena in the general store, the way certain women in Millard Creek managed to look through her when she was standing directly in front of them, started to take on a harder edge through April and into May. Margaret Aldridge was the first to say something directly to Elena's face, which at least had the virtue of honesty. It happened at Millard Creek's dry goods store on a Saturday morning when Elena had come in for supplies and found Margaret and 2 other women already at the counter. The women didn't move aside the way you'd move aside to let someone in. They simply continued their conversation in a way that made the space feel unavailable. Elena waited. She had patience that had been built through circumstances these women couldn't imagine, and she was not going to give any of them the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. Margaret turned eventually, as though noticing her for the first time. "Miss Ashcroft," she said. The tone was exactly calibrated. Not overtly rude, just weighted. "Still keeping yourself busy up at the Creed Ranch?" "Yes," Elena said. "I heard you've been involving yourself in the land management." She said, involving yourself the way you might say making a mess in someone else's kitchen. "That must keep you occupied." "It does," Elena said. She held Margaret's gaze with a steadiness that she could see was slightly disconcerting. "I heard your father's north pasture had a bad winter. I hope the spring grass comes in better than expected." It was a perfectly civil thing to say. It was also a reminder that she knew things about the valley ranches, that she'd been paying attention, that she wasn't operating in the dark the way they might prefer. Margaret's expression adjusted itself slightly. "I'm sure it will," she said, and turned back to the counter. Elena got her supplies and left. She didn't tell Ronan about it when she got home, because there was nothing he could have done about it, and no particular point in adding to what was already a complicated enough situation. But she thought about it on the drive back, about the particular kind of dismissal that relies on smallness, on making someone feel like they're taking up space that was meant for someone else. She'd felt it before, in other places. It didn't hurt less with familiarity. It just got easier to absorb without showing. What was harder to absorb was what happened with the horses. Ronan had in his remuda 3 young horses that had never been properly broken, started technically, meaning they'd had a saddle on their backs, but not finished in any way that made them reliably usable. One of them, a gray gelding with a stubborn streak that had defeated 2 of the hands who'd tried to work with him, had been sitting in the north paddock doing nothing expensive except the feed he ate. Ronan had been considering selling him. Elena asked if she could work with the gray. Ronan said yes, mostly out of curiosity about what would happen. What happened was slow. That was the first thing. She didn't push the horse or try to establish control through the usual progression of pressure and release that most of the hands would have used. She spent the first 3 days doing nothing that looked, from a distance, like anything useful at all, standing near the fence while the horse did what he wanted, moving when he moved, stopping when he stopped, existing in his space without making demands of it. The hands who watched this from across the yard had varying opinions about whether it was going anywhere. On the 4th day, the gray came to her at the fence without being called. Cal Marsh saw this happen and mentioned it to his brother at dinner. By the following week, the gray was carrying a saddle without resistance, moving under Elena's hands with the loose, willing energy of an animal that has decided to cooperate rather than one that's been forced into compliance. Rose, the quietest of the hands, the one who communicated primarily through the angle of his hat and the direction of his attention, watched this for several days without comment. Then one morning he came to Elena at the paddock fence and said, "The bay mare. She won't be caught. Could you—" and then stopped, as though uncertain how to finish the sentence. "I'll take a look at her," Elena said. Rowan was watching from the barn doorway. Something in his chest did a thing he chose not to examine too carefully. The explosion, when it came, arrived from a direction he'd been watching and still wasn't entirely prepared for. Joel Calloway came to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon in mid-May with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man delivering news he's not entirely sorry about. He was the kind of neighbor who maintained a surface of cordiality while operating underneath it with the consistent self-interest of someone who keeps a very accurate ledger of what everyone around him is worth. Ronan met him on the porch. "Just come from a meeting at Aldridge's," Joel said. "Figured you ought to know what was said." "I appreciate that," Ronan said, which was not entirely true but was the right thing to say. "The general position," Joel said, "is that you've mismanaged your relationships in the valley. The Aldridges feel disrespected. The Pembertons feel the same. There's talk about the water rights on your southern boundary, specifically whether the current arrangement is as beneficial to all parties as it should be." Ronan felt the specific cold of a threat that comes packaged in the language of reasonableness. The water rights arrangement on the southern boundary had been in place for 11 years. It had never been a problem before because he'd never given anyone a reason to make it one. "And what's the talk about specifically?" Ronan said. "About reviewing the terms," Joel said. "Nothing official, but Pemberton mentioned it. And when Pemberton mentions something like that, it tends to find legs." He paused. "I want you to know I didn't add my voice to it. I don't think it's the right play, but I'm one voice." "Why are you telling me?" Joel looked at him steadily. "Because I've been in this valley long enough to know the difference between a problem that gets resolved and one that gets worse. And I think you're walking toward the second kind." He put his hat back on. "Whatever you think about the girl, and I'm not in the business of telling a man how to run his personal life, the practical problem is that powerful people feel like you made a statement when you brought her on, and powerful people who feel insulted do things that cost everybody." He left, and Ronan stood on the porch long enough for the dust from Calloway's horse to settle. Elena was at the barn, doing something with the bay mare. He could see her through the fence, calm, methodical, the horse moving toward her in the tentative way of an animal that's beginning to recalculate something. He watched her for a moment. She must have felt the weight of his attention because she looked up. Something in his expression communicated itself across the distance between them, and she walked over to the fence. "What happened?" she said. He told her. She listened without interrupting, which was a quality he'd come to rely on without noticing he was doing it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The water rights," she said. "If they actually move to renegotiate, what would that mean for the South Fields?" "Expensive," he said. "At best. At worst, it kills our summer yield." She nodded slowly, thinking. "Is Calloway on our side or their side?" "Neither. He's on Calloway's side, which right now happens to point in our direction." "That's something," she said. "Not much, but something." She looked out across the field, the regraded irrigation channels, the improved south pasture, the slow and genuine recovery happening in the land. "They're going to move against us," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," he said. She looked back at him. "Then we need to make sure that when they do, there's less to move against than they're expecting." She paused. "And more fight in it than they're planning for." He looked at her, at the lean, careful face, the direct eyes, the total absence of panic or performance, just the same clear-eyed accounting that she brought to everything else. "I didn't bring you into this to make your life harder," he said. "I know," she said. "You brought me in because the feed receipts were short, and you needed the books kept straight." A pause. A small, dry thing crossed her face that wasn't quite a smile but came from the same direction. The rest of it we both walked into with our eyes open. He thought about what Harlan Aldridge had said at that dinner meeting. There are women in this valley, with family, with property, with connections. All the things Elena didn't have, laid out like a verdict. What they hadn't accounted for was what she did have, which was, he was beginning to understand with a clarity that had been arriving slowly and was now more or less complete, everything that actually mattered for the fight they were about to be in. Back at the barn, the bay mare that hadn't been caught in weeks was standing still while Elena's hand rested steady on her neck. Easy, like it had been that way all along. The drought came the way bad things often do in the high desert, not as a single event, but as a slow, grinding absence. May dried out faster than anyone expected. June offered 3 days of rain in the first week, and then nothing after that, the sky hardening into a flat, white glare that sucked the moisture out of the ground and the energy out of everything living under it. By the second week of July, the grass in the lower pastures had gone from green to yellow to the particular brittle gold that old-timers in the valley recognized as serious trouble. Ronan had seen drought before. He knew how to read it, knew the difference between a dry spell that broke and one that was going to run itself out over months. This one had the feel of the second kind. The creek that fed his main irrigation diversion was running at about 60% of its normal summer volume, and it was dropping. He'd already reduced the herd's grazing rotation to spare the most productive pastures, already started rationing water to the hayfields to keep as much of the hay crop alive as possible through the worst of the summer heat. The improvements Elena had made to the Southfield irrigation channels paid off in a way that was measurable and real. The better water distribution meant they were getting more coverage per unit of water than they would have under the old system, which made the rationing go further. Deke, who had initially presented Elena's ideas to Ronan with the reluctant caution of a man who wasn't sure he was doing the right thing, now defended the irrigation setup with the energy of someone who had decided it was his own idea and was not going to be talked out of it. Elena never corrected this particular rewriting of history. It wasn't worth correcting. What was worth watching through June and into July was the hay. The hayfields were the ranch's primary insurance against a hard winter. 8 acres of cultivated grass that, in a good year, produced enough baled fodder to carry the herd through the coldest months without buying expensive supplemental feed. In a drought year, the hayfields were the first thing to suffer and the last thing you could afford to let go. Ronan was walking them every other day, checking the moisture in the soil at root depth, adjusting the irrigation schedule in increments that felt inadequate against the scale of what the sky was refusing to provide. It was on one of these evening walks, in the last week of July, that Elena said the thing she'd been thinking for a while. "There's a reservoir," she said. She was walking beside him along the eastern edge of the hayfield, the low sun casting both their shadows long and thin across the dry stubble. "Up on the mountain, the old Creekstone Reservoir, you know it?" He stopped walking. "I know of it." "What do you know?" "That it was built by the original Creekstone mining operation 30 years ago, that the mining company abandoned it when they pulled out of the territory, that everyone I've talked to says it's been dry for 20 years. He paused. "Why?" "Because I don't think it is," she said. He looked at her. "Elena, I've been up twice," she said, and then caught the expression on his face. "I know, I should have said something. I wanted to be sure before I brought it up." She turned to face the mountain. "The access road is overgrown. It took me 3 hours to get up there, but the reservoir wall is sound, better than it has any right to be after 30 years. And there's water in it. How much water?" "I don't know exactly. Not full. But not nothing, either. Probably a third, maybe more. The snowmelt feeds it from the upper range drainage. It's slow, but it accumulates." She turned back to him. "If the drought runs through August the way I think it's going to, we're going to need it." He stood in the evening field and thought about this for a moment. "The access channel to the lower range would need to be rebuilt," he said. "Even if the reservoir has water, getting it down here is a separate problem." "I know," she said, "but it's possible. The original channel beds are still there, stone-lined, most of them. They'd need clearing, some repair on the damaged sections. It's work, but it's work we can calculate." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the hayfield. The stalks were shorter than they should have been at this point in the summer, the heads thin. Another 3 weeks of this heat and no rain, and it wasn't going to matter what his irrigation setup looked like. You went up there twice, he said. Alone. Yes. That trail is not safe. The trail is difficult, she said. I was careful. Elena. He said her name with a weight that she recognized. Not anger exactly, but the specific frustration of someone who has started to care about what happens to a person and is just beginning to understand how uncomfortable that is. If something happened up there, nobody would have known where to look. She held his gaze. I know, she said. I'm sorry. Next time I'll say something first. He exhaled. All right, show me the survey you've done. She had done a survey, as it turned out. She'd sketched the reservoir dimensions as best she could estimate them, marked the condition of the original channel beds from memory, noted the sections where the channel had collapsed and would need rebuilding. She laid it out on the kitchen table that night, and he and Deke looked it over with the lantern pulled close, the way the three of them had developed a habit of working through problems together in the kitchen's yellow light. Deke had his doubts, which he expressed with the practical specificity of a man who has built and repaired enough infrastructure to know which objections matter. The rebuilt channel section in the middle slope would be expensive. The reservoir access gate, assuming there was one and assuming it still functioned, was an unknown. The time to completion, if they started immediately, was still probably 4 to 6 weeks, which might be too late if the drought peaked in August the way Elena thought it would. What's the alternative? Elena said. Wait and see if the creek comes back? The creek might come back, Deke said. It might, she said. Do you think it will? Deke looked at the survey sketch for a moment. Then he shook his head slowly, with the honest resignation of a man who has stopped arguing against the evidence. No, he said. I don't think it will. They started on the channel clearing the following week. All 6 hands, plus Ronan and Elena working alongside them, pushing through the overgrown upper section where decades of scrub growth had filled in the original stone-lined beds. It was the worst kind of work. Slow, hot, physically punishing, with no immediately visible progress to sustain the energy you were spending on it. Cal Marsh, who had a gift for saying what everyone else was thinking at the moment they most needed not to be thinking it, announced on the 3rd day that he had never in his life been this tired and this thirsty while working on a project theoretically designed to produce water. Then stop talking about it and keep digging, Elena told him, without looking up from the section of channel bed she was clearing. Yes, ma'am, he said, which was the first time any of the hands had called her that. He probably didn't notice he'd said it. Elena noticed. The reservoir access gate was a problem. It was the original iron sluice mechanism from the mining operation, and 30 years of non-use had left it seized in the closed position with the kind of rust that laughs at basic tools. Ronan spent an afternoon up there with rows and an assortment of equipment, and they eventually got it to move. Not smoothly, not in the controlled way it was designed to move, but enough to test whether water would flow when it was opened. It would. Not fast, but steadily. Enough. By the first week of August, the upper channel sections were clear, and the repairs on the middle slope were mostly complete. Ronan calculated that they were, conservatively, 2 weeks from having a functional water source in reserve. He didn't know they were running out of time of a different kind entirely. The first sign was the water. 3 of his cattle started showing symptoms of illness on a Thursday. Off their feed, lethargic, showing signs that the ranch's old veterinarian, reached by telegraph and then messenger, identified from the description as consistent with poisoning rather than disease. Ronan walked the south pasture water source himself, where the cattle had been drinking from a secondary creek feed point, and found the water running with a slightly off smell that wasn't immediately obvious but was there when you put your face close to the surface. He pulled the cattle off that water source immediately, checked the rest of the herd, lost 1 steer before the day was out. A 4-year-old that had been in good condition going into summer and was dead by sundown, the loss of it hitting Ronan in the chest with the particular weight that comes from watching something healthy die, of something that shouldn't have been able to reach it. He found the point of contamination the next morning. Someone had dumped something. The veterinarian's later analysis would suggest a quantity of copper sulfate, the kind used in small amounts for certain agricultural applications but lethal in concentration. into the creek feed about 300 yards upstream of his water intake point. The amount used was not the kind of mistake someone makes. It was the kind of decision someone makes deliberately. He stood at the contamination point for a long time without saying anything. Deke was beside him. They both looked at the water. Pemberton's land starts 400 yards up, Deke said. I know where Pemberton's land starts, Ronan said. I know what you're saying, Ronan said. Don't say it out loud yet. They went back to the ranch. Elena was in the yard when they returned, and she read something in Ronan's face before he'd said a word. What happened? She said. He told her about the contamination, the dead steer, the copper sulfate. As he spoke, her expression moved through something he hadn't seen on her before. Not fear, not anger, but a focused, cold clarity. The kind of look that appears on a person's face when they've stopped hoping a situation is different than it is. They're not going to stop with the water, she said. No, he said. What else? He didn't have an answer for that. Not yet. The cattle answered for him 2 nights later. The stampede started somewhere after midnight. Ronan came awake to the sound of it before he was fully conscious. A deep, rolling thunder that his body recognized before his mind did. The ground vibration of hooves moving fast and in quantity and in the wrong direction. He was out of bed and at the window before he'd registered the decision to move. The south pasture fence was down. He could see the gap from the window, a dark absence in the pale line of the fence, and through it the shapes of cattle moving in the panicked, purposeless rush of animals that have been deliberately frightened. In the moonlight he could make out figures on horseback beyond the broken fence, 2, maybe 3, moving in the outer dark where they'd be harder to see. He was dressed and out the door in under 2 minutes. Deke was already in the yard, and Cal and Teddy were coming from the bunkhouse pulling their boots on as they ran. Abe appeared from somewhere, already saddled, which meant he'd heard the cattle before anyone else and had started moving while the main house was still sleeping. Ronan caught a horse and went after the herd, which had scattered southeast toward the canyon country. It was the worst direction they could have gone. The canyon edges in that part of the range were dangerous in daylight and dangerous in a completely different way at night, with drop-offs that cattle didn't see until they were already falling. He rode hard through the dark, following the sound, reaching the leading edge of the running cattle and working to turn them with the half-blind urgency of a man trying to prevent a catastrophe by touch, because there wasn't enough light to see properly. Cal came up on the other side, and between them they managed to turn the lead animals, sending them north and away from the worst of the canyon edge. He didn't know until the next morning how many they'd lost. The answer was 7, which was not the worst possible answer, but was not one he could easily absorb either. He rode back toward the ranch as the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, and he smelled the fire before he saw it. The hayfields were burning. Not the whole field. Not yet. The fire had started at the southwest corner and was moving northeast in the direction of the night's prevailing wind, which was the direction of everything else. Ronan pushed his horse to a run and came up to the yard to find Elena already there. Already organizing, already giving directions in a voice that didn't carry panic, just information delivered fast and in the right sequence. South fence line, get every available body on the south fence with whatever they can use to beat it back, she was saying to Teddy. Not to put it out, to slow it down and keep it from jumping to the barn. She turned to Rouse. Get the horses out. All of them now. Take them to the north paddock and lock them in. She was moving as she spoke, not watching to see if they did what she said, already committed to her next action. She ran directly toward the burning field. Elena! Ronan's voice caught up with her at the gate. Elena, wait! The water channel, she said, stopping just long enough to face him. Her eyes were bright and completely steady. The new irrigation channel on the south field. It's full right now from last night's cycle. If we open the diversion valve, we can flood the field bed. She grabbed his arm, not hard, just enough to make sure he was listening. It won't put the fire out, but it'll saturate the field from below and slow it down. Buy us time. He looked at the fire, which was moving with the deliberate, unhurried confidence of a fire in drought-dry grass. Already the smoke was thickening, rising in a dark column that would be visible from Millard Creek at first light. The valve's at the south junction, he said. I'll get it. I'll go with you. You're needed here, he said. He looked at her for 1 second. Keep them focused. Don't let them waste energy fighting what they can't stop. He ran for the south junction. The diversion valve was a heavy iron gate mechanism, the same design philosophy as the reservoir sluice, built to last and correspondingly difficult to move without leverage. Ronan got it open by brute force and badly scraped knuckles, felt rather than saw the water begin to move through the channel into the field's lower distribution network, and turned back toward the fire line. The flooding bought them perhaps 40 minutes, not enough to save the field. The corner section where the fire had started was going to be a loss regardless. But it slowed the advance enough that by the time the eastern sky was fully light, they'd managed to contain the fire to the southwest third of the hayfield, the rest of it scorched and smelling of ash but not burned through. The barn was untouched. The horse remuda was safe in the north paddock. They stood in the yard in the full morning light, everyone exhausted, ash on their faces and arms, breathing the acrid smell that would sit over the ranch for days. Elena looked at the burned field. She didn't say anything for a moment. There was something in her face that was harder than what he usually saw there. Not defeat, but the look of someone doing a rapid and realistic accounting of what has been lost and what remains. "The reservoir channel," she said. Her voice was rough from smoke. "Where are we on it?" 2 weeks, Deke said. He sounded exhausted. "Maybe 12 days if we push." "We push," she said. She looked at Ronan. "They're going to find out about the reservoir. Someone who works for them will see the channel work and figure out what it connects to." She held his gaze. "When they do, they'll move against that too." He looked at her for a long moment. His hands hurt. His lungs felt gray. A third of his hay crop was ash and 7 cattle were dead in the canyon, and the people who'd done all of it were probably eating breakfast right now without having lost a night's sleep. "Then we work faster," he said. "Yes," she said. "We do." She turned and went back toward the hayfield, not with any illusion that there was something left to save in the burned section, but to assess what remained, what could be salvaged, what the actual number looked like before they started planning around it. She walked through the ash-edged grass at the boundary of the burn with the same careful, methodical attention she brought to everything, bending occasionally to test the ground, mapping the damage with her eyes the way she mapped everything else, honestly, without softening it. The hands watched her. Even Deke watched her. There was something in the watching that was different from before, not the uncertain assessment of the early months, not the reserved judgment of men deciding whether she was worth their respect. Something quieter than that, something that had been earned the hard way. The only way anything in this country ever really was. Abe came to stand near Ronan at the edge of the yard. The old man's face was gray with ash and fatigue, and he held his hat in his hands. "They're not going to stop," Abe said. "No," Ronan said. "You know what they're counting on." "Tell me." Abe looked out at the scorched field, at Elena still walking the burn line. "They're counting on you deciding it's not worth it." He paused. "That the cost of fighting them is higher than the cost of giving in." Ronan watched Elena stop at the far edge of the burned section, crouch down, press her palm flat against the scorched earth in a gesture that was hard to read from a distance. He thought about February, the thin smoke from a near-dead fire in an empty cabin, a woman who'd made it through the worst of winter alone with nothing but her own stubbornness and a hatchet. He thought about the feed receipts, the irrigation channels, the gray gelding that nobody could work until she did, the bay mare, calm under her hand. He thought about what this place had looked like before she'd arrived, and what it looked like now, even with ash on the fields. "They're miscalculating," he said. Abe glanced at him. "They've been working on the assumption that she's the weakness," Ronan said, "that if they push hard enough against the thing they don't understand, it breaks." He watched her stand up, brush the ash off her palm, and continue her assessment of the field with the complete composure of someone who has decided they're not done yet. "She's not the weakness." Abe was quiet for a moment. Then he put his hat back on. "No," he said. "I don't reckon she is." The morning held its breath around them. The burned smell, the thin smoke still rising from the field's edge, the exhausted quiet of people who have been through a hard night and are already thinking about what comes next. The mountain stood where it always stood, cold and indifferent at its peak, And somewhere up that mountain, behind the overgrown trail and the seized iron gate, and 30 years of everyone's assumptions about what was and wasn't there, water was accumulating in the dark. It was the only thing right now that felt like the future. They finished the reservoir channel in 11 days. Not 12, not 14, 11. Because Elena revised the work sequencing on the third day and found a way to run 2 crews simultaneously on sections that Deke had assumed needed to be done in order. It required more coordination and more physical presence from everyone involved, including Ronan and Elena themselves, working sections of channel bed that the hands would normally have handled without the ranch's principals in the dirt beside them. Nobody complained about this. After the night of the fire, the atmosphere at the ranch had changed in a way that was difficult to articulate but easy to feel. A tightening, a shared orientation toward the same point. The way people move together when they've been through something hard and have collectively decided they're not finished. The reservoir gate was the last piece. Ronan went up with Deke and Rouse on the 11th day to open it fully for the first time, and they stood at the sluice mechanism in the thin mountain air and looked at each other with the caution of people who have invested heavily in something that might not deliver. The gate opened. The water moved. Slowly at first. A dark line finding its way down the newly cleared channel, absorbing into the stone-lined bed, pushing through the repaired sections with the tentative energy of something that's been still for a long time and is remembering how to move. Then steadier. Then with genuine volume, the kind you could hear from 20 feet away. Deke let out a breath that he'd probably been holding for 2 weeks. Rose, who communicated exclusively through action and the occasional tilt of his hat, pressed his palm against the channel wall where the water ran and held it there for a moment with an expression that came as close to relief as Rouse ever got. Ronan stood and watched the water run and felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't fully acknowledged was there. When he got back to the ranch, Elena was at the south field checking the progress of the unburned sections. The 2/3 of the hayfield they'd managed to save. She'd been tracking recovery growth for the past week, measuring it daily with a consistency that was either necessary or obsessive, probably both. She looked up when she heard his horse. "It's running?" she said. "It's running," he said. She nodded once, and something in her face settled. Not celebration. She wasn't built for that kind of reaction, or not right now, with too many other things still unresolved, but a real and genuine relief that she didn't try to hide. "How much time does it buy us?" she asked. "Through the drought and into fall, if we're careful with it," he said. "The hayfield sections we saved should recover enough with supplemental water to give us 60, maybe 70% of a normal yield by cutting time." "That's enough to carry the herd through winter," she said. "Barely," he said. "But yes." She looked at the field for another moment. "They'll find out we got the reservoir working." "They probably already know," he said. "Hard to hide a channel project and a change in the creek flow." He dismounted, tied the horse to the fence post, came to stand beside her. "Whatever they're planning next, it'll come soon. They're not going to wait and let us stabilize." She didn't respond right away. She was looking at the mountain, the way she sometimes did when she was thinking through something that didn't have a clean answer yet. Then she said, "I've been thinking about Joel Calloway." "What about him?" "He came to warn you," she said. "Which means he's watching both sides of this, and he's not entirely committed to theirs." She paused. "If things get worse, if Pemberton and Aldridge push this to the point where the whole valley is caught in it, Calloway might matter." "Calloway looks out for Calloway," Ronan said. "Yes," she said. "And right now it might be in Calloway's interest to not have his valley torn apart." She turned to look at him. "I think you should go talk to him." He considered this. The idea of going to Calloway felt like a concession, and his instinct resisted it. But Elena had a way of pointing at things from an angle that made them look different than they did straight on, and when he thought about it straight on, she wasn't wrong. Calloway wasn't an ally, but he wasn't an enemy either, and in a situation that was rapidly running short of anything in the middle, that was worth something. "I'll ride over Thursday," he said. He never made it to Thursday. Wednesday night, the storm that had been building in the northwest mountains for 3 days finally broke over Harrow County with the kind of violence that the high desert produces when it finally ends a drought. Not the gentle, gradual rainfall that the ground could absorb and be grateful for, but a wall of water that hit the hardpan soil with more force than it could process. 3 inches of rain in 4 hours. The kind of event that old men in the valley would reference for years afterward, usually when they were trying to make a point about how bad things could get. The reservoir, which they had just finished filling through the channel, received a significant portion of the mountain runoff directly and had nowhere to put it. The sluice gate, designed for controlled release, not emergency overflow, had opened to its maximum position when Ronan had gone up 11 days before, and it had not been adjusted since because there had been no reason to adjust it. There was a very good reason now. Ronan was awake when it started, listening to the rain hit the roof with the specific alarm that a rancher feels when the sound changes from rain to something heavier. He was out of bed and dressed before Elena knocked on his door, which told him she'd heard it at the same moment he had. "The channel," she said when he opened the door. She was already in her boots and coat, her hair loose and wet from the few steps she'd taken from her room. If the reservoir overflows, the channel becomes a conduit for everything the mountain is shedding right now. He was already moving past her. "I know." "Ronan," he stopped. Her voice had something in it that he'd never heard before. Not panic, but a kind of careful urgency that told him she'd already thought past the immediate problem to the one after it. "If the channel overflows at the lower junction, the water goes into the basin. The Aldridge lower fields are in the basin. The Pemberton Creek crossing is in the basin." He stood in the hallway for 2 seconds and let that land. "The people who burned our field," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "What are you saying?" She met his gaze directly. "I'm saying we have a decision to make before the water makes it for us." She paused. "We can ride up and close the reservoir gate and reduce the outflow. It'll probably save their property. It might damage the channel. We'd be holding back more water pressure than the gate mechanism was designed for, and there's a real chance it fails badly and we lose the whole reservoir project. Or we do nothing," he said. "Or we do nothing," she said. "And by morning, their lower fields are flooded and their creek crossing is washed out and we've hurt them the way they hurt us, and we didn't even have to plan it." The rain hammered the roof. Outside, he could hear water starting to run hard through the yard, channeling between the outbuildings. He didn't think about it for very long. Part of him wanted to. Part of him wanted to stand in the hallway and fully experience the satisfaction of the choice that cost him nothing, of watching the people who had poisoned his water and burned his fields and stampeded his cattle receive exactly what they'd put into motion. It was a real feeling, and he didn't lie to himself about it. But he thought about the Aldridge lower pasture and knew, without being able to say precisely how, that there were families and houses in that basin. Workers' families. People who had nothing to do with Harlan Aldridge's decisions. Children who were asleep right now in the path of water that was getting up speed on a mountain they couldn't see. "Wake the hands," he said. "All of them. We're going up." Bam. Getting to the reservoir gate in the dark and the rain was the most difficult physical thing Ronan had done in years. The access trail, which had been difficult enough to navigate in dry daylight, was now running with water in the spots where the gradient was steep, the footing treacherous in a way that required constant attention and deliberate movement. He went with Deke and Rouse because they were the most capable in difficult conditions, and because he didn't have time to manage anyone else's fear along with his own. Elena had gone a different direction. Before he'd left the ranch, she'd reorganized the remaining hands with the same clear efficiency she'd used the night of the fire. Cal and Teddy directed to dig emergency diversion channels at the low point of the ranch's east boundary to redirect runoff away from the barn foundations. Abe sent to check the herd and move the cattle that were in the low-lying north section to higher ground. "You're not coming up with me," Ronan had said. "I'm not built for the gate mechanism," she said. "You and Rouse can move that. I'm more useful down here." She looked at him. "Get it closed enough to drop the outflow by half. Don't kill yourself trying to get it all the way down." "Practical advice," he said. "I try," she said. And then, before he turned away, "Be careful." He'd almost made a joke out of that, the kind of deflection that men make when someone says something that actually reaches them, and then didn't, because she wasn't being sentimental and didn't deserve a deflection. "You too," he said. The gate took the three of them 40 minutes in the rain and dark, Rouse on one side of the mechanism and Ronan on the other, Deke holding the lantern and calling out what he could see of the channel flow below them. The mechanism was stiff with the cold rain and the pressure the backed-up water was putting against it, and there were several moments when Ronan genuinely wasn't sure it was going to move at all. His hands were raw. Deke dropped the lantern once, and they worked in complete darkness for a few minutes until he got it relit, which was a few minutes that Ronan thought about later more than he thought about the rest of it. The gate moved. Not all the way, not to closed. Elena had been right that the mechanism couldn't handle that under this pressure without risking failure, but enough to reduce the outflow significantly, enough to take the worst of the force out of what was running down the channel. They could hear the difference in the sound of the water below them. Deke wiped rain off his face and held the lantern up to look at the gate position. "That's about as good as we're getting tonight," he said. "Good enough," Ronan said. His arms hurt from the shoulder down. They went back down the mountain. What they found at the bottom was not what Ronan had expected. The diversion channels Elena had directed Cal and Teddy to dig had worked. The barn foundation was clear of standing water, and the yard, while muddy and running, was not flooded. The herd was on high ground. The ranch infrastructure, all of it, had come through the worst of the storm in reasonable shape. What he hadn't expected was the activity in the road below the ranch gate. There were 2 wagons on the lower road, both of them bogged in the mud, and beside them several figures with lanterns. Men he recognized, even at this distance and in the rain. The Aldridge ranch foreman, a heavy man named Burke. 2 of the Pemberton hands, and behind them, barely visible in the lantern light, a woman and 2 children standing in the roadbed with water running around their ankles. Elena was already at the gate. He came up beside her. "What is this?" "The Aldridge lower bunkhouse is flooded," she said. Her voice was controlled, but there was something careful in the way she said it. "The creek crossing on the Pemberton East Road washed out. These are the hands and their families trying to get to higher ground." She paused. "They came up our road because it's the only way through." He looked at the people in the road. Burke, the Aldridge foreman, met his eyes with an expression that was completely impossible to read. Embarrassed, maybe. Angry, probably. Aware of the position he was in, definitely. "Burke," Ronan said. "Creed." Burke said his name with the flat effort of a man who has set aside a great deal in order to say one word. "We need to get through to the Upper Ridge Road." "How many people?" 8 adults, 3 children. A pause. 2 of the children are the Aldridge grandkids. They were staying at the bunkhouse with the family of one of the hands. Ronan stood in the rain for a moment. Elena said quietly, just for him, "Your call." He opened the gate. "Get them up to the barn," he said. "It's dry. There's a stove." Burke's expression did something complicated and landed somewhere that wasn't gratitude exactly, but was adjacent to it and clearly cost him something to get to. "Creed, just get them out of the road," Ronan said. Chet. The barn held 11 people for the remainder of the night, not counting the ranch hands who moved in and out dealing with the ongoing logistics of a ranch in the middle of a major storm. Mrs. Garza, who had appeared from the house with blankets and a cast-iron pot of something hot, without anyone asking her to, managed the human side of it with the brisk competence that she managed everything. Elena helped her, moving between the Aldridge and Pemberton families with a matter-of-fact practicality that didn't make a point of itself. Blankets distributed, hot food offered, wet boots pulled off children who'd stopped crying mainly because the adults around them had stopped being scared. Ronan watched this from across the barn. He watched the way Elena spoke to the Pemberton hand's wife, a tired young woman holding a sleeping toddler. Nothing remarkable about the conversation, just the ordinary human transaction of making sure someone had what they needed. He watched the way the Aldridge grandchildren, a boy and a girl who looked about 7 and 9, gradually relaxed as the warmth of the barn and the hot food reached them, eventually falling asleep on a hay bale with a horse blanket thrown over both of them. Burke came to stand near him at one point, both of them looking out at the rain through the barn's open-top door. "The south gate," Burke said. "Who went up to work the reservoir gate tonight?" "I did," Ronan said, "with Deke and Rouse." Burke was quiet for a moment. The channel was running hard before it eased off. We were watching it from the lower road. He turned his face toward Ronan. "You went up there and reduced the outflow." "Yes." In that, he gestured at the rain. We built the channel, Ronan said. Seemed like our responsibility. Burke looked at him with something in his face that sat uncomfortably between his professional role, which required him to be loyal to the Aldridge family, and therefore, by extension, in opposition to Ronan, and his personal response to what Ronan had just said, which was clearly something different and didn't have an easy place to go. I know what they did, Burke said. To your water, to your field. He said it quietly, in the voice of a man being careful about what he admits out loud. I want you to know I didn't have any part in that. I run cattle. I don't run... He stopped. I don't do that kind of thing. I know you don't, Ronan said. Harlan's not... He's not a bad man. Burke seemed to hear how that sounded and added, he's wrong about this, about how he's been handling it. But he's not. The fire wasn't his idea. That was Pemberton. I think you ought to know that too. Ronan absorbed this without responding immediately. The Pemberton name sat in his chest in a particular way. He'd suspected it, but suspecting and being told directly by someone with knowledge of it were different things. Why are you telling me this? He said. Burke looked at the sleeping children on the hay bale. Because my employer's grandkids are asleep on your hay right now, he said. And you went up a mountain in the middle of the night to protect his property, and I think at some point a man has to be straight with people who deserve it. He put his hat on. That's all I'm saying. He walked back to where the Aldridge families were gathered, and Ronan stood at the barn door and watched the rain, and thought about what Burke had just handed him. Not an alliance, not an apology, but a piece of the truth offered at some personal cost by a man who had decided, in the arithmetic of a hard night, that honesty was what the moment required. Elena appeared at his shoulder. What did he say? He told her the relevant parts. She listened, and he could see her mind working through the implications with the same systematic quality she brought to the ledger numbers. Pemberton, she said. Pemberton, he said. That changes things. She looked out at the rain, which was finally, around 3 a.m, beginning to ease. Burke will tell Harlan what you did tonight. Harlan's not stupid. He'll understand what it means that you went up that mountain. She paused. It might not be enough to stop Pemberton, but it might be enough to split them. And a split is what we need, he said. A split is what we need, she said. He looked at her. She was tired, genuinely tired, in the visible physical way, not the kind that could be managed through will. There was a smear of mud on her jaw from somewhere, and her hair was still damp from earlier. She was also, despite all of this, still thinking, still turning the problem over, still finding the next angle. Elena, he said. She turned. He didn't say anything for a moment because what he wanted to say was not something he'd fully organized into words yet, and he was not the kind of man who said things before they were ready. But it was there. Something real and clear, grown in the way that things grow between people who have worked alongside each other through difficulty and found that the other person doesn't disappear when it gets hard. You should get some sleep, he said finally, which was not what he'd meant to say exactly, but was also true. She looked at him for a moment, and in the look was an awareness that he hadn't quite said what he was thinking, and something that was not quite a question but was curious about the gap. She let it go. A few hours, she said. There'll be enough to deal with when it's light. She went back toward the house. He stayed at the barn door until the rain had dropped to a drizzle, and the first very faint gray suggestion of morning was appearing at the eastern edge of the mountains. In the barn behind him, the Aldridge children slept on. The Pemberton families were quiet. His own people moved around the margins of the space, doing the small, necessary things that kept a ranch functional through a hard night, with the easy familiarity of people who trusted each other. He thought about what Abe had said, the morning after the fire. They're counting on you deciding it's not worth it. They'd been wrong about that. And they'd been wrong about something else too. They'd assumed that Ronan Creed's value to the valley was the 600 acres, and the water rights, and the position in the network of alliances that held the whole county together in its rough and imperfect way. What the night had just demonstrated, in a way that nobody could easily dismiss, was something different. That when a mountain shed its water into a dark basin, and the roads washed out and the children needed dry ground, the ranch at the top of the ridge had opened its gate. That mattered more than they'd calculated. In the morning, he suspected, some of them were going to start to understand that. The last of the rain let up just before dawn, and the wet world outside the barn went very quiet, the way it does when a storm has finished saying what it came to say. Somewhere down the ridge, water was still moving through the channels. Controlled now, directed, doing what water does when someone has spent the time to understand where it wants to go and built accordingly. He went inside to wait for the light. Morning came slowly over Harrow County, the way it does after a storm that has taken something from everyone. Cautious, gray at the edges, the light arriving without much confidence in itself. Ronan was at the barn door when Harlan Aldridge rode up the ridge road just after 7. He came alone, which was notable. Harlan was a man who traveled with the weight of his position around him, usually a hand or two, sometimes his eldest son, always the invisible presence of the Aldridge name doing its work in advance of him. Coming alone meant something. Ronan wasn't sure yet what. He looked older than the last time Ronan had seen him. The storm, or the night, or something else had taken a few years' worth of careful presentation off the man's face, and what remained was just a tired rancher in his 60s who had ridden out in the early morning because he felt he needed to. Harlan dismounted. He didn't offer his hand, and Ronan didn't move to take it. "My grandchildren slept in your barn," Harlan said. "They did," Ronan said. "They're fine. Mrs. Garza fed them breakfast an hour ago." Harlan looked at the ground for a moment. It was not a comfortable look. It was the look of a man doing arithmetic he doesn't like the answer to. "Burke told me about the reservoir gate," he said, "that you went up in the middle of all that to close it down." "The channel was our project," Ronan said, "our responsibility." "You could have left it," Harlan said, "after what was done to your field." He said this directly, which was the first honest thing Ronan had heard from him in a long time. Most men would have. "I'm aware of that," Ronan said. Harlan was quiet for a moment. Down the road, one of the Aldridge hands was helping load the family that had sheltered in the barn into the wagon for the ride back. The 2 children, the grandchildren, were visible at the wagon's tailgate, the younger one still carrying the horse blanket that Mrs. Garza had given her the night before. Harlan watched them with an expression that had nothing political in it at all. "The fire," he said finally. "I want you to know that was not something I authorized or knew about in advance." "Burke told me it was Pemberton," Ronan said. Harlan's jaw moved. "Pemberton acted without consulting me. He stopped. Started again. "Arthur Pemberton has a way of going further than the situation calls for. I should have managed that better. I didn't." He looked at Ronan directly. "That's the truth of it." Ronan considered this for a moment. It was not a full accounting. There was a considerable distance between "I didn't authorize the fire" and "I bear no responsibility for the situation that made someone think the fire was an option." Harlan knew that, probably. They both let it sit without either of them saying it out loud, because the morning was already carrying enough weight. "What do you want, Harlan?" Ronan said. "I want this to be over," he said. "The water poisoning, the fire, the stampede. That's not how I want to run things in this valley. And after last night..." He stopped, looked at his grandchildren again. "I'm done with it." "Pemberton isn't done," Ronan said. "No," Harlan said. "He's not. And that's a problem I'm going to have to handle on my own side." He paused. "But I'm telling you that you won't have the Aldridge family working against you anymore. Whatever Joel Calloway is willing to do, I'll match it." He rode away without waiting for a response, which was either dignity or avoidance, and was probably some of both. Ronan watched him go and then stood in the yard for a while in the quiet after-storm morning, feeling the complicated texture of what had just happened, which was not resolution, not forgiveness, not even a clear truce, but the beginning of a shift in the valley's weight distribution, and that was something. Elena was standing at the corner of the barn. She'd heard it. He could tell from her expression that she'd heard most of it. "He'll hold to it," she said. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't entirely certain either. "He'll hold to it," Ronan said. "Harlan cares about his family. What he saw last night, his grandkids in our barn, he won't walk away from that." "And Pemberton?" He looked toward the eastern range, where the Pemberton land started beyond the ridge. "Pemberton is a different problem," he said. Arthur Pemberton did not come to them. That was not his nature. What he did instead over the following 2 weeks was the thing that men of his particular type do when they find the social architecture shifting against them. He started making noise through official channels. He filed a complaint with the county land office about the reservoir project, claiming the channel work interfered with historical water drainage patterns affecting his property. He sent a letter to the Territorial Water Authority suggesting that the Creekstone Reservoir had been illegally reactivated without proper authorization. It was harassment dressed in paperwork, and both Ronan and Elena understood it for what it was. But paperwork had teeth, especially in a territory where the legal structures were still being built out, and the people administering them were often susceptible to the pressure of established money. Elena spent 4 days in Millard Creek's small public records office going through the original Creekstone mining claim documents, the Water Authority filings from 30 years prior, and the land survey records for every parcel between the reservoir and Ronan's southern boundary. She came back on the 5th day with a stack of documents and the expression of someone who has found exactly what they were looking for and is choosing to be calm about it. She laid the relevant papers on the kitchen table. The Creekstone Reservoir was built under a mining claim that included explicit water rights to the natural drainage basin above the current channel bed, she said. When the mining company abandoned the claim, the water rights should have reverted to the Territorial Land Office. They didn't. They were improperly transferred to a land-holding company in 1871, which dissolved 4 years later. The transfer was never finalized with the Territorial Authority. She set one specific document on top of the stack, which means the water rights were never legally held by anyone after 1875. They've been effectively unclaimed for 50 years. Ronan looked at the document. And if they're unclaimed, then the first party to file a legitimate use claim with evidence of active beneficial use has the strongest legal position. She looked at him steadily. We've been running water through that channel for 3 weeks. We have documented evidence of the work we did to restore it and witnesses. Pemberton's complaint actually helps us, Ronan said slowly. It draws official attention to the question, which forces the Water Authority to review the ownership history. Which reveals that his complaint has no standing, Elena said, because he has no documented claim to the water rights he's asserting are being violated. He sat back in his chair and looked at her across the kitchen table. The same table where they'd gone over feed receipts in February, where Deke had looked at irrigation survey sketches, where the ledger had been laid out night after night through the spring and the drought and all of it. A lot had happened at this table. You're sure about the documents, he said. I've read them 4 times, she said. I'm sure. He nodded once. Then we filed a claim. They filed it through a lawyer in Millard Creek named Harmon, a careful and deliberate man who read Elena's research with the concentrated attention of someone who is genuinely surprised by what he's finding. He asked her several specific questions about the 1871 transfer documents and where she'd located them. She answered each one precisely. Harmon looked at her over his reading glasses with an expression that was trying to reconcile what he was seeing. A young woman without formal legal training who had done better archival research than most attorneys he knew, and not quite landing anywhere comfortable. This is solid work, he said, which was the kind of statement that lawyers make when they mean something stronger but aren't sure of the propriety of saying it. Thank you, Elena said. Harmon filed the claim. Pemberton's complaint was reviewed and found to have no documented basis. The Territorial Water Authority issued a preliminary ruling within 6 weeks that the reservoir water rights were legitimately claimable and that the Creed Ranch's active beneficial use filing had priority standing. It was not the end of the legal process. These things rarely ended cleanly. But it was the turning point, and everyone in Harrow County understood it as such. Arthur Pemberton was a man with powerful instincts for self-preservation. When the Water Authority ruling came down and Harlan Aldridge quietly withdrew from the alliance, Pemberton did what men like him do when the strategic landscape changes. He moved on to other priorities, other pressures, other valleys. He never apologized. He never acknowledged what had been done to the Creed Ranch's water supply or hayfields or cattle, but the pressure stopped, and in the particular economy of frontier justice, where clean resolution was a luxury most people couldn't afford, that was the closest thing to accountability that was likely to arrive. It was Abe who said, one evening in September, when the alfalfa they had regrown in the salvaged hayfield sections was being cut and the air smelled of green and work, that Pemberton stopping was better than Pemberton being sorry. Sorry doesn't fix a fence, Abe said. Stopping does. Ronan, who had been thinking something more elaborate than that, found he couldn't argue with the simpler version. The fall came in cool and clear, the way it sometimes did after a hard summer, as though the land was apologizing for what the previous months had cost. The reservoir continued to run through the main channel, steady and reliable, supplementing the creek flow that had recovered somewhat when the rains finally arrived in late August. The hayfield yield, when Deke calculated it at the end of the cutting season, came in at 64% of a normal year. Not good, but enough. The herd had come through the summer at 33 animals, down 7 from the canyon losses during the stampede, and those gaps in the count were the kind that stayed with a rancher through the winter in a way that balance sheets couldn't fully account for. The gray gelding that nobody had been able to work had been working clean under saddle for 2 months. The bay mare had been handled and restarted and was now reliable enough that Cal used her regularly without complaint. 4 of the horses in the remuda were in better condition going into winter than they'd been at any point in the previous 2 years, because someone had been paying attention to their movement, their weight, the small signs of what they needed before the needs became problems. The Southfield irrigation channels were performing at the level Elena had projected when she'd first sketched them on a piece of paper at the kitchen table in April. The water distribution data she'd been tracking through the growing season showed yield improvement in those sections that, annualized forward, represented a meaningful change to the ranch's long-term financial picture. Deke had stopped presenting her ideas to Ronan as though they were his own, which was a form of progress that nobody formally acknowledged, but everyone noticed. Joel Calloway came to dinner in October, which was the first time he'd set foot on the Creed Ranch socially. He and Ronan talked business for part of the evening and general valley matters for the rest of it. And at some point in the conversation, Elena said something about the water rights case that made Calloway go very still, look at her, and then say, "Where did you learn to read territorial land filings like that?" "I taught myself," she said. "I had time in February before I came here." Calloway looked at her for a moment longer than was entirely comfortable, in the way of someone recalibrating something. Then he looked at Ronan. "You know you've got something unusual here," he said. He said it plainly, as a statement of fact, which was the closest Joel Calloway got to a compliment. "I'm aware of it," Ronan said. That what Ronan didn't do, through all of this, was say the thing that had been sitting in him since the night of the storm. Not because he wasn't sure of it, he was sure of it, with the particular certainty that arrives not as a sudden feeling, but as an accumulated weight of evidence that a person who has been hurt before is reluctant to trust. He'd been wrong about Catherine Walsh. Not about who she was, he'd read that correctly, in the end, but about his own capacity for judgment, and that had done something to his confidence in himself that took a long time to repair. What he'd learned about Elena Ashcroft over the course of nearly a year was not the kind of thing you learned about a person at a dinner party or a social gathering or through the strategic presentation that families in this valley made of their daughters. He'd learned it through the feed receipts and the irrigation channels and the reservoir trail in the dark and the night of the storm and the records office in Millard Creek and every ordinary morning in between. He knew how she thought. He knew what she did when things went wrong. He knew that she didn't perform, didn't manage her presentation, didn't say things to be heard rather than to communicate. He knew that she had stayed. Not stayed the way a person stays when leaving is inconvenient, but stayed the way a person stays when they found something worth staying for and are willing to accept the cost of it. She could have left after the fire. She could have left after the night of the stampede, or when Margaret Aldridge looked through her in the general store, or when it became clear that the valley's opposition wasn't going to be brief or easy. She hadn't. She'd gone back to the burn line the morning after the fire and started assessing what remained. And in that single image, Ronan understood something about her character that no amount of polished social performance could have communicated. He told her on a November evening, when the first serious cold had come down from the mountains and the kitchen was warm and the day's work was done. He told her plainly, in the direct way that had always felt most honest to him, not with the elaborate architecture of a declaration, but as a simple statement of something true. "I don't want you to leave," he said, "not as a ranch hand, not in the way things have been. I want you to stay as—" He paused. He wasn't a man who stumbled over words usually, and the stumble was real and visible, and he didn't try to cover it. I want you to stay because I'd rather do this with you than without you. All of it. Whatever this place is, whatever it becomes, I want it to be ours. Elena was quiet for a moment. The lamp on the table was the same lamp it had always been, casting the same yellow light over the same kitchen table. Outside, the wind was coming down off the ridge the way it had that February morning when he'd first knocked on the door of an empty cabin and a woman had answered with a cast-iron pan in her hand. "You took a long time to say that," she said. "I know," he said. "Were you afraid I'd leave if you said it wrong?" He thought about this honestly. "I was afraid of saying it and having it not be enough," he said. "After everything you've built here, I didn't want you to feel like you were being asked to trade one kind of dependency for another." She looked at him across the table. "Ronan," she said, "I've never done anything here because I had no other choice. I stayed because I wanted to, because this work matters, and because—" She stopped. Something in her face moved that wasn't her usual careful composure. Something more unguarded than that, more real. "Because you're the first person I've ever worked alongside who treated my judgment like it meant something, who didn't need me to make myself smaller to fit." "You couldn't make yourself smaller," he said. "I don't think you know how." Something crossed her face that was finally a smile. Not the dry, almost smile that appeared sometimes when something was darkly funny, but a real one. The kind that started in her eyes and reached the rest of her face slowly, like it was checking the territory before committing. "That's probably true," she said. "Is that a yes?" he said. "It's a yes," she said. "It's been a yes for a while. I was waiting for you to catch up." "What?" "There is something that the Valley of Harrow County looked like by the following spring that is worth accounting for honestly, because the story of what Elena Ashcroft and Ronan Creed built there gets told sometimes in a way that makes it sound cleaner than it was. The ranch was strong, genuinely strong, the best it had been in years, maybe the best it had ever been. The irrigation improvements had paid forward through the fall planting, and the spring grass was coming in on the south fields with a density that made Deke stand at the fence line one morning in March and say nothing for a long time, which was his highest form of approval. The reservoir ran clean and reliable. The remuda was in excellent condition. The ledger, for the first time in 3 years, showed a trajectory that Ronan could look at without the specific anxiety of a man who is always calculating how much room he has left. But it wasn't perfect, and it wasn't simple. And the valley didn't transform overnight into a community of people who had seen the error of their ways and emerged as better versions of themselves. Harlan Aldridge was cordial and kept his word and never became a friend. Margaret never quite looked at Elena without something residual in her expression, though she stopped saying the particular things she'd said before, which was the kind of progress you took because it was what was available. Pemberton's property changed hands the following year under circumstances that were described as a business decision, and probably were, and nobody in Harrow County spent much time on the details. Joel Calloway became, in the measured and unsentimental way of a man who respects results, someone who sought Elena's opinion on land and water matters with a regularity that would have been unimaginable the previous spring. He never apologized for the position he'd held when the valley was organized against the ranch. He paid for the advice and the only currency he trusted, fair dealing and useful information shared in return. And in the economy of the frontier, that was probably the most honest form of respect available. What changed in Harrow County was not dramatic. It was the slow, structural kind of change that happens when people see something they can't unsee and have to rearrange their thinking around it. They had seen a woman with no family name and no inherited position walk into a failing operation and understand it, fix what was broken in it, defend it when it was attacked, and do all of this without performing for anyone or asking for permission. They had seen a man who had been written off as difficult and mistrustful open his gate at 3 a.m. in a rainstorm to shelter the children of people who had tried to destroy him. They had seen what those two things, put together, actually produced, and it was harder to dismiss than the comfortable assumptions they'd been operating on before. The thing that nobody in the valley said directly, but that most of them understood in the way you understand things that reorganize your sense of what's possible. Elena Ashcroft had not succeeded because she had managed to work around the fact that she was an orphan with nothing to her name. She had succeeded because those circumstances had produced a person with a kind of knowledge and resilience that wealth and family connection had no reliable method of generating. She knew how to make something out of not enough because she had been doing it her entire life. The valley had looked at her and seen absence. What was actually there was the opposite. Ronan understood this about her before anyone else did. That was the thing he'd been trying to articulate to Harlan Aldridge that night at the dinner meeting, back when all of it was still forming. The difference between the value people performed and the value people actually carried. He hadn't said it well then. He said it better the following spring at the land office in Millard Creek, when a clerk who was handling the formal recording of the water rights claim looked at the filing and asked about the party of interest. "Elena Creed," Ronan said. She was standing beside him. She didn't react to hearing the name. They discussed it. But he felt the small shift in her posture, the almost imperceptible straightening of someone who has been handed something they weren't sure they'd ever get to hold. The clerk wrote it down. The water rights were registered. The work was on record. Outside the land office, on the main street of Millard Creek, Elena stood for a moment in the spring light with her face turned toward the mountains. The same mountains that had been there in February when she was burning salvaged wood in a borrowed cabin to stay alive through the cold. The same mountains above which water had been quietly accumulating for 30 years, waiting for someone to notice it. "All right," Ronan said. She turned toward him. The spring light was not dramatic. The street was not empty and waiting for a moment. There were people going about their business around them, horses and wagon noise, and someone arguing with someone else outside the hardware store. Everything ordinary and real and continuing. "Yes," she said. "Let's go home." They went home. The ranch was waiting, the way the ranch always waited, with the same indifference to human drama that land has always had, the same requirement of daily work, the same capacity to return what you put into it over time if you put in the right things. That was the truth of what they'd built, and it was enough. More than enough. It was, in the end, everything.